welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me Ibrahim, Sani. Now, in the lead up to our own Independence Day, let's turn our attention to one of the world's youngest nations, East Timor, or now known as Timor-Leste. Tomorrow, on August 30th, Timor-Leste will celebrate the 20th anniversary of the referendum that gave it its independence from Indonesia. Now, our colleague Sharaad Kuttan is there in Timor-Leste right now, and he joins us on the line. Good evening, Sharaad. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about why you're there in Timor-Leste and not here in the studio with us?
Well, I'd like to say I'm on a holiday, but I'm not. I've come partly because I was involved in the Asia-Pacific Conference on East Timor in 1996. It was held in Kuala Lumpur, the second iteration of that conference. The Solidarity Movement was essential to drumming up support and creating visibility for the cause of East Timor before they achieved independence and before the Indonesian government was pressured into granting them a referendum. Now, I've just come from the presidential palace, and I've come across town. Dili is actually quite small, and I've come across town to an open air area where there's a big concert going on, and you can hear the music at the back. And if you could just about hear the music, it's actually being sung in Bahasa Indonesia. A lot of people here still speak Bahasa Indonesia. Many of the elite speak Bahasa Indonesia. It's a fascinating place 20 years on.
Sharaad, I just want to ask you about the Malaysian connection with Timor-Leste. Kamal Bamat Haj, he was a student activist that was killed many years ago. Could you tell us a little bit more about him?
Well, Kamal was a Malaysian. His mother was from New Zealand. He was student working in, he was a student in Australia. Had come to volunteer in 1991. What was going to be a kind of process of understanding what was happening in the territory occupied since the invasion of East Timor in the mid-70s. Now, Kamal was killed at the Santa Cruz massacre. I mean, Santa Cruz massacre was one of many massacres against the Timorese who resisted or for whatever reason found themselves up against the Indonesian military in the country. On the Santa Cruz massacre, and I'm not too far away from the Santa Cruz cemetery. One of the biggest issues then was that there was no visibility for this. The Malaysian media was actually quite silent. And if you cast your mind back to 1991, the RTM actually had images from the Santa Cruz massacre. They had to apologize to Indonesia for broadcasting that. Our Minister of Information actually flew to Jakarta to apologize personally to the Indonesian government. General Suharto was a powerful, powerful man in ASEAN in those days, and he kept the issue of East Timor very silent.
Right, Sharaad. Okay, so let's talk about the past 20 years. 20 years ago, the people of East Timor voted overwhelmingly to reject Indonesia's plan for special autonomy. Instead, they wanted to pursue independence. Now, what has that reconciliation process been like? What are some of the, lessons that you've observed while you're there?
Well, you know, the numbers are staggering. In a country that was so small, estimates are some 200,000 people died during the Indonesian occupation of Timor-Leste. 150,000 from a famine that happened in the late 70s, caused essentially by actions of the Indonesian government and the Indonesian military. So about 150,000. The remainder were just killed in various other kind of massacres and such. Now, coming up to the referendum that was brokered after Indonesia had its own reformasi and democratization process, B.J. Habibie, who's just had a bridge in Dili inaugurated in his name, he is seen, for all his worth, seen as a man who had the courage to give the referendum process a chance. And what happened following that referendum, as you said, overwhelmingly the Timorese voted for independence and not autonomy as the Indonesians hoped, is that the Indonesians backed a militia, mostly manned by Timorese, that massacred people. They targeted the liberation movement leaders. They went on systematic rape, looting, and arson. They destroyed as much infrastructure as they could as this young nation was just beginning its journey. And it was because of the restraint of the independence forces that the international community was finally moved, and the big powers were finally moved to intervene in East Timor and to restore justice. Now, of course, a lot of problems here with peace and reconciliation, a lot of people who committed those murders and rapes not tried in court. So how do you find justice? That's a big question. Huge amount of processes, memorials, museums, all in an attempt to find some peace with the past. But I think now, as a young person at an event today said, the struggle is no longer for independence, it's for development.
So, Sharaad, I just want to follow up on that. You know, I read that the Economist, they put in their democracy index for 2018, they ranked Timor-Leste as the most democratic country, country in Southeast Asia. So, have you seen that? Have you seen the democratic dividend be paid out in Timor-Leste?
Yeah, I mean, you know, part of the democratic dividend, of course, is instability in politics, but the last couple of years have been fairly stable, hard at providing popular participation in development, and they try very hard to give voice to younger people, to ordinary folk. That is an aspiration they have. The reality is always fall short of that. I've been here too short a time to have my own independent assessment. But, you know, beyond democracy is the question of jobs and the economy. Growth has been at 3.4% annually for some time, but it hasn't necessarily led to job growth. In fact, job growth has been largely led by the public sector, something that the government itself doesn't think is either sustainable or desirable. So they're looking for the private sector to come in. They sponsor a lot of cooperatives as a way of sort of also generating income and jobs and such. For a very young nation that needs to give young people a stake in the future.
Sharaad, I see some parallels of that happening here as well, but I just want to highlight one particular clip that we have right now. It is of the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Timor-Leste. Let's pull up the clip.
Geografis Timor-Leste ada di ASEAN, dan dulu semasa Indonesia pun Timor-Leste adalah bagian dari ASEAN. Kemudian kedua, Timor-Leste telah diterima oleh semua negara ASEAN, di mana Timor-Leste telah mendirikan semua embassy di negara-negara ASEAN. Ketiga, ASEAN adalah sebuah region di mana ada penduduk sekitar 630 juta lebih, dengan sebuah pasar lebih dari 2,3 triliun dollars. Dan Timor-Leste merasa bahwa sangat cocok sekali bagi Timor-Leste untuk bisa juga menjadi bagian dari ASEAN. Di samping itu secara geopolitik, Timor-Leste sudah sign Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, juga anggota dari ARF, dan juga banyak sekali konvensi.
Of course, Sharaad, it has been 8 years since Timor-Leste has been formally asking to enter ASEAN. It has not yet been accepted. And of course, you spoke to the minister just now. What do you make of that conversation with him?
Well, you know, he was putting the best and most positive face on the situation. It's been an unusually long time. It's been, I guess, since 2011. So we've had 8 years. They've been waiting for a word. Malaysia is very, very positive. Saifuddin Nasution said our foreign minister said that he's all for it, Saifuddin Abdullah, rather. But ASEAN is a consensus-based regional grouping, so some people are not convinced, partly because of the question of the uneven economic status of the different countries in the region, and East Timor being very tiny and very poor. Question is, how are they going to kind of integrate into the plan? Will they be able to deliver all the obligations they will have to deliver on? So I think Dionysius Babu Suarez, the foreign minister, went on that tour, as he said, to convince ASEAN that they are ready to be integrated and become the 11th member of the regional grouping.
Sharaad, you mentioned a bit earlier that Timor-Leste really wants to focus on its economy. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the last 10 years, the Timor-Leste government's policies, economic policies, have largely been shaped by the windfall in terms of their petroleum revenue. So they've got some wealth thanks to the oil reserves that they have. And if they also have a sovereign wealth fund for this oil money, don't they? Are there parallels that you see to Malaysia? Are they learning lessons that we have had to learn the hard way?
Well, okay, so one of the things they've done is they subscribe to something called the Santiago Principle, which is about good best practices in terms of governance of sovereign wealth funds. That's something they're committed to. But I was just talking to somebody from the fund just now at the presidential palace, and he was saying to me the conversation about the purpose of the wealth fund has changed over the last 10 years. At least from his point of view, Norway is not an adequate comparison. Norway is very conservative in the way it deals with its oil wealth. And he's saying that as a country as young with huge developmental needs, they have to use the fund more proactively. Now, the question is, the balance between a conservative policy that doesn't squander the future for the present as opposed to ignoring the present and therefore not building your future. I think that was how he put it to me. That is the conversation that the Timorese are having today about their oil wealth.
Sharaad, as much as I enjoy taking your place here in this show, I got to ask you when you're coming back, but of course, what are your main conclusions before you come back to KL, that is? What are your main conclusions? What are your main takeaways of your time in Dili?
Well, as somebody who was part of the solidarity movement in a case that perhaps people just assumed in the mid-90s, this was a hopeless case. And there was no chance that Timor would ever be free. It's a vindication for all those crazy people who stood outside embassies with candles. It's also crazy. It's a vindication for all those people who believe today that other territories haven't been decolonized. The president of the republic mentioned Western Sahara in his speech. We know, of course, that the Papuans are also struggling. The from Irian Jaya, their protest today. And Indonesia has to think very carefully about its own response to the people of Papua, of West Papua. And also, we, again, Malaysians have to find the empathy for people who want self-determination. We do it for the Palestinians. Do we think about the others around the world? Western Sahara, West Papua, and all those other territories not decolonized that remain occupied.
All right, thanks, Sharaad, for joining us today. We're looking back to having you here in the studio with us. So we're going to be back in just a couple of minutes, so stay tuned to consider this.